yearn and strive for government, protecting our liberty.
Good evening and welcome to Your Right to Know by the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. My name is Mary Lotze and I will be your co-host for this evening's show. Joining me as usual is my good friend and co-host, attorney Andrew Couture. Andrew, of course, as always, as also a city councilor in Ward 3 in Fitchburg. Hi, Andrew. How are you sitting in front of City Hall?
Hi, Mary. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, even though we're still all locked inside our houses. We'd also like to recognize and thank Workers Credit Union for their support and supporting the First Amendment and bringing this show to you tonight. Joining Andrew and I tonight is our good friend and chairman of the Fitchburg Republican City Committee, Chairman John Strang, Dr. John Strang. Thank you for being with us, John.
Thank you for asking me.
John, tonight we're going to start out by talking about progressivism and progressives and the progressive policies. This actually came up. Andrew and I had talked about it. We were helping our friend Kathy Clark run for the state House representative seat for Lunenburg, Shirley, Acton, Foxborough. And we saw her, her competition put up yard signs. And the yard signs very blatantly and openly referred to this individual who ultimately won the election, the special election, as a progressive Democrat. And I was asked to describe, what does a progressive Democrat mean? What does a progressive really mean? And that's when I talked to Andrew and we wanted to reach out to you, because this is kind of your bailiwick, is understanding these movements throughout history. So as an opening, I really would like you to explain your background and education and understanding these political movements in history, and to give us sort of a historical perspective of what progressivism is.
Thank you. Well, my background is in philosophy. I have a doctorate in philosophy from Boston University. I specialized in ancient philosophy and modern German philosophy, but when I taught all phases of philosophy. There are relatively few students who will major in philosophy, so you wind up as a teacher teaching everything that comes up. As to how I'm prepared to address the issue of progressivism, well, political philosophy is one of the major areas of philosophy, and progressivism certainly would fall under that heading. We'll have a chance, I think, to go into some of the historical changes that occurred to progressivism. But progressivism essentially was and is a philosophy of political philosophy emphasizing the need for social reform. And in general, if you leave the definition that broadly, there tends to be agreement between people on the right and people on the left that there are occasions when social reform is needed. The issue is in the details, how deeply these reforms or so-called reforms intend to go. Now, if you want me to go into the historical background now, I can start that.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please.
Well, probably it's kind of ironic that the major man behind progressivism is a name probably most progressives don't recognize. He was a French Enlightenment philosopher and mathematician named the Marquis de Condorcet. And Condorcet, toward the end of his life, actually, he died during the Terror. He was a supporter of the French Revolution, but like many supporters, including intellectual ones, he wound up dying under mysterious circumstances in his case. He wrote a book published after his death called Outlines of an Historical View of the Progress of the Human Mind. And I'd just like to quote a little bit from this, from the beginning of it, because it gives a sense of the broader dimensions of progressivism. He says this at the beginning of his book. He says, "I will show from reasoning and from facts that no bounds have been fixed to the improvement of the human faculties, that the perfectibility of man is absolutely indefinite, that the progress of this perfectibility, henceforth above the control of every power that would impede it, has no other limit than the duration of the globe upon which nature has placed us. The course of this progress may doubtless be more or less rapid, but it can never be retrograde, at least while the Earth retains its situation in the system of the universe. So Condorcet adopts the view that not only do we live in a world in which progress occurs, but it is inevitable. And he's very strong about this. He says it can never be reversed. In other words, we cannot imagine any reversal to situations prior to the modern age, which he would place in the era we would call the Industrial Revolution and after. Now, this assumption that we live in a world in which progress is inevitable is taken for granted by many people. What's not understood or appreciated is that the assumption betrays a lot of assumptions of its own. For example, suppose you happen to be a religious individual. You believe in the tenets, say, of Christianity, maybe Catholicism. What happens when some of those tenets are perceived as coming in conflict with this asserted inevitability of progress? This is not a topic I bring up carelessly, because just this topic is occurring right now.
Right, it is. I think of at least two areas.
Exactly.
And abortion and euthanasia even.
Right, and a third one would be gay rights. Mm-hmm. There recently was a Democrat congressman who denounced the Catholic Church in particular because he perceived them as anti-gay rights. Now, what is an issue here is how far are progressives willing to go in their assertions of the inevitability of progress as they see it, and what limits do people who have questions about that, what limits are they willing to place on that asserted progress?
We could also claim Sharia law. I don't want to get off the topic, but right, Sharia law.
Right. There are many. Yeah, that would be another area from a completely different culture. But within our own mainly Western lineage, we would say there. And the irony here is that in the past, in the American past, until relatively recently, there was broad agreement between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, that certain projects, certain goals of social reform were necessary. No one, for example, pitches now for a 14-hour workday. No one pitches now to have children working in mines. And certainly elements like, for example, the disenfranchisement of women. Both Republicans and Democrats agree on that. These are all projects that really were worked out in the 19th and 20th centuries. And slavery, of course. These are all areas where liberals and Democrats and Republicans have agreed.
Andrew, as you open up for your question, you also might even think of gun rights and how we now perceive gun rights.
I would think of gun rights, but going off of what John has said, they're basically, that's what they're doing. They want to erase history, hence, not going back, and they want to erase the history. That's why they're tearing down the statues. They're even going so far as spray painting a statue of Stevie Ray Vaughan.
What does he represent in history?
Mary, I don't. Other than musical history, which I'm a fan of him, but I just don't think they're educated enough to understand, what history really means, and how these symbols mean. We don't go back, to that, but it's a memory of what has happened. And they just want to tear it down without any kind of, without any kind of remorse. And that's what's really tragic here.
Yeah, I think you've touched on something very essential. What you're implying is that certain extreme progressives want to erase our memory of our history. It's not enough to eliminate social injustices. They want to go beyond that. That's something we can go into. One of these extremist groups, of course, is Antifa, and I'm prepared to talk about them. But let me just briefly sum up areas where there have been agreement between the right and the left. I mean, at least we can look back to our history and say, well, we're not inevitably going to wind up as enemies because we have agreed on certain things. In the 19th century, the notion that there should be unrestricted laissez-faire economic behavior was an area where Republicans and Democrats agreed that there needed to be constraints on that. Even such an icon of conservatism as the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck actually enacted progressive legislation in a state that was overwhelmingly conservative. He provided provisions for ordinary workers and provisions for people who were injured on the job. This was the first time this was done in history by any state. Our own President Theodore Roosevelt once said that he believed that wise progressivism and wise conservatism go hand in hand. These were areas of agreement. They started to veer off course when Woodrow Wilson came into power, because Wilson was willing to, and he was a political philosopher or a political scientist to a degree, he was willing to sacrifice elements of the United States Constitution if he thought that they infringed on the claims of progressivism. We need a whole program on Woodrow Wilson to go into that. But this is where things started to go off the rail as far as conservatives and Republicans are concerned. That areas of agreement, common agreement, were taken beyond an appropriate limit. You alluded to education, and of course, this is a major area where progressivism has made an impact. It's not surprising because most of the people who go into teaching in our public schools have taken courses in colleges and teaching, departments of teaching, of education, and you don't get into those departments if you're not a liberal. I know, as a conservative, I was not exactly, surrounded by other conservatives in the liberal arts school that I taught at. It's worse than. What's that?
Surprise for you, John. Guess what? I majored in high school education at Fitchburg State, and I guess you could call me undercover.
Yeah. It's so what is happening now? I mean, we're living now, as we all know, here in the end of June 2020, having experienced almost a month of incredible behavior and misbehavior on the part of young people, not just young people, who are supposedly graduates of our public education system. And Andrew, you hit this earlier. They don't really know what they're doing. They don't know history.
They're tearing down a statue of Abraham Lincoln, after the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, isn't that what this is all about? Is equality?
It is absolutely amazing. One would not credit that people could demonstrate and do such vile acts against individuals like Lincoln. Lincoln, my God, who freed the slaves. But it's happening. It's happening. I think, by the way, Mark Stein, we all know Mark Stein, had the best description of this movement. He calls it the March of the Morons. The March of the Morons. And
Very appropriate.
Yeah, because these people, they just don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. They're revolting for the sake of revolution.
Well, John, one of the things that I'm very concerned about is that they are getting a voice. They are getting powerful and more powerful. We saw AOC just won a primary earlier this week. She was being challenged by other Democrats for the seat. But she, again, came out and won because she is one of the most progressive faces and voices of the movement today. And what they're looking at things is, we see it on our college campuses, not just in our education, but what we're allowing to be said on college campuses. We're shutting down free speech. We're shutting down free expression. We our freedom of worship, free thought, destruction of monuments, historical statues, art, the overall destruction of the rule of law. How can this be acceptable to people, to voters? Don't they see this as being absolute destruction and devastation of our nation?
Well, the founding fathers assumed that the American people would be an informed citizenry. So they had a vested interest in education. We've gone a long way since then. I imagine that when you went to public school, I assume you went to public school, and Andrew, I assume you did too.
I did.
When I went to public school, it was still a credible institution. I mean, my school in Ohio was a public school in northeastern Ohio. It delivered the basics. I had good relations with all the teachers. There was a general camaraderie, a willingness to learn. There was not this pitch for social activism, which we see as so characteristic now, coming in even at the school level, almost at the elementary school level. Activism was not perceived as an appropriate area for a young person to dedicate his or her time to. Now it's being taken for granted.
Your parents wouldn't even have supported it because they felt that there was a very distinct difference between what was learned in school was the reading, writing, and arithmetic, which they wanted everything to be very uniform amongst all schools. And they would teach those other things. So if they were activist parents, they would teach that. If they were religious or conservative parents, they would teach that. But that happened in the home. Now we don't even seem to have education valued in the home.
Right. It's if you find an educated young person today, there's a good chance that that person has been educated in the home school.
Yes.
Because so much time is wasted in public schools. I was always opposed to the notion of allowing a sweeping range of choices for young people. I always felt in school, in high school, for example, I always felt they should get the basics. And this came across to me as a teacher, because I found when I asked students to write essays on my exams, in philosophy, of course, an essay is a good indicator of how a student understands something. I discovered that most students couldn't write essays. They couldn't write 2 paragraphs. They had difficulty composing 2 paragraphs. Now, we would say that, yes, well, with the proliferation of electronic devices like the computers and so on, maybe you don't need to be able to write that much. But they couldn't do it orally either. That's also something I found, that if a student can't compose something in writing, that same student could not do so orally. So neither of these is being brought across. The basics have been eliminated. Teachers of the basics have been replaced by social activists. The role of sociology, that subject matter called sociology, has been extremely influential in education, including in college education. That's the department behind the proliferation of many of these activist sub-departments.
John, as I was telling you, when I was in school in college, as you know, to be a high school English teacher, I remember, and this was when I ended that major, is we had to come up with reading plans and you know study guides and whatnot, and I kept concentrating on Moby Dick, Shakespeare,
classic.
On the classic, yeah.
You know, the things that everybody should read, and I was chastised by my professor as to being too old school and they should read Harry Potter instead.
Right. And it's worse than that. I mean, now it's worse than it was then. You'll find now college English departments that do not require Shakespeare. They don't require.
How can you not have Shakespeare?
Exactly. How could you not? You know, Shakespeare is the monument of English language and literature. How could you not require him? But it's seeped in everywhere. And earlier, Mary raised the question, what can be done about this? Well, the truth is that much of it is beyond the point of help. If I were a parent having school-age young people, I would homeschool them, or I would send them to a private school that I knew, whose curriculum I knew very thoroughly. I'm so fed up with, disgusted with the public school system.
John, we've got like 5.5 minutes left, so we have time, and I really don't want to end this show without talking about Antifa. Right. There's a lot of people who just don't know what Antifa means. Is Antifa one of those things? Is not every progressive is supporting of Antifa, but every Antifa is a progressive? I mean, is it kind of that conundrum?
It's actually more extreme than that. Antifa, to give it its historical background, the word is actually a condensation of the German, the antifaschistische Aktion, the anti-fascist action, Antifa. It actually originated way back in the 1920s and early 30s in Germany. Antifa was the paramilitary arm of the German Communist Party. And I don't know if this comes across, I'm going to try to show this. Can you see that?
No.
No?
Yeah.
Yes.
Back it up a little bit.
There? That better?
Back. Go back.
Draw it back.
Draw back. Okay, maybe you can make out some of it. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert at doing these graphics on computer screen. But
I know we don't have Mike in the back room.
This is a photograph of the headquarters of the German Communist Party in Berlin in 1932. And it has slogans in the top, Antifaschistische Aktion gegen Krieg, Hunger und Faschismus, anti-fascist action against war, hunger, and fascism, vote KPD, that's Communist Party Germany. So 1932, this is the year before Hitler took over. So this Antifa goes back a long, long time. It actually, in its present form, it was revived in the period in the 1970s when there was this so-called Red Brigade movement in Germany, extreme leftists who kidnapped and murdered opponents. The symbol of Antifa is two flags, a red flag and behind it a black flag. Now the red flag we know, of course, symbolizes socialism in general, Marxism. The black flag symbolizes anarchism. So this is where these people are coming from. They are extremists. They advocate. If I can get a list here, if I can find it among the many things I have. They advocate, of course, the elimination of capitalism. They are in favor of a policy of eliminating all traces of a dominant capitalist society. They believe in violence, the use of violence to silence their opponents. This is, by the way, something that goes back to the 1920s and 30s in Germany. People forget that before there were Nazis, there were these thugs on the left. And indeed, many people have said the Nazis were a response to them.
But we only have 2 minutes left, but don't we have this now happening by our progressive movement, which is actually mimicking Antifa and working with Antifa to eliminate capitalism, to organize speech and how we think,
right.
Get rid of...
It's not enough for them to listen to an opponent's views. They don't want to give an opponent an opportunity to present his views. For example, Milo Yiannopoulos, a conservative, a gay conservative, very prominently 3 years ago, I guess it was, tried to speak at Berkeley University in California. And the Antifa destroyed the scene. They did hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage to the scene, and the university backed down. You have to appreciate that they are not people that you can get to cooperate with you. Now, I do not imply that all the protesters who have been taking part in these extreme activities like vandalism of churches, like destruction of buildings, like tearing down statues. I'm not saying they're all Antifa, but they are influenced by Antifa.
Mm-hmm.
And that's right. One also has to be aware that in the history of revolutionary movements, you always have masses of naive people who are led by the nose. This is, as long as there have been these movements, there have been people who naively think that the only way to eliminate social injustice is to be violent. Relatively few people are willing to do this, but it's an indicator of how extreme our situation is now that more and more people are willing to follow these violent methods.
Which includes defunding police and authority.
Exactly, defunding police, yeah. It's a sad commentary on where we are. Now, I know any conservative is going to say at this point, Well, yes, but we also have the Second Amendment, and there are tens of millions of Americans out there who have the right and they maintain the right to bear arms to protect themselves. We hope it doesn't come to that. But when we see the behavior of such weak administrations in the major cities like Seattle, Portland, New York, Minneapolis, and so on, we recognize that's not how it works in small town America. But God help us if it really comes to a fight, because the people on the extreme left, the Antifa people, are not going to cooperate.
No.
Have we crossed the line? Gone too far?
What's that, Andrew?
I said, have we crossed the line? Do you think we've gone too far over? Or is there, how long is this going to be going on? I mean, Venezuela has been fully changed from democracy to socialism in 10 years. I mean, I don't think we should have any doubt. Well, we have some strong hope that Trump will be reelected. But what's going to happen after that?
We can't see that far into the future, but we certainly know the stakes involved.
Unfortunately, I have to end it there. Our time is up, believe it or not. This is way too timely and way too important of a topic. Maybe next month we'll be back in the studio, and maybe this is something we really will need to go into further explore, especially if what we have happening in our streets and in our cities continues to happen. I know it's frightening for all of us. And so as we close tonight, I thank you, John, for being with Andrew and me as we have this show. And as we leave our viewers tonight, we want you to remember and thank you for watching Your Right to Know and being part of the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. And remember that your city or town Republican Committee welcomes you because we hold dear your constitutional rights and your conservative values. And we will challenge things like and associates like Antifa and the progressive movement. To us, GOP stands for growth, opportunity, and prosperity for all people. And because we always stand for freedom. I thank you and good night.
America, we stand for freedom. So let us all unite to yearn and strive for our republic that reflects our values, that preserves our rights, and goes forth in power and might, that reflects our values and preserves our rights, and goes forth in power and might.